it's about healing. Stem cells are nature's. I always begin all my lectures on stem cells with this slide, which shows Christopher Reeves. This slide says everything I want to say in my talk. First, it shows what spinal cord injury does to a superman. It reduces a superman to a subhuman existence. But what he says is very important. Christopher Reeves said, I would go anywhere in the world for a therapy that's safe, and I underline safe, and that could accomplish the goal of recovery. So these two things are very important. Before we think of any therapy, any approach, we have to, the first question we have to ask ourselves, is it safe? And then, is there some hope or some potential of recovery? My hypothesis is slightly different from a lot of other people in this field. I don't believe that stem cells alone work. In fact, in our institute, we don't even use the word stem cell therapy. And I'll tell you what we refer this whole thing to. What I believe is likely to work is a combination of neuroprotective therapies, cellular therapies, and rehabilitation. And I think it's a combination. It's like anything. It's like a malignancy, a malignant brain tumor. You have to operate it, remove it. You have to give radiation therapy. You have to give chemotherapy. That's how you treat tumors. So, for spinal cord injury and for other intractable neurological disorders, we're going to need a combination. One of the things that happens sometimes when we research into something is we get so focused and narrow in the field that we are focused on that we don't see the wider picture. So as surgeons, we tend to see the wider picture, and then researchers tend to see what they're working on. And it's important that we speak to each other, because there's so much to share. It's from what we learn in life, what we learn from the bedside, that things in the laboratory come, and from the lab we work. So I mentioned this right at the beginning because one of the criticisms of the two trials we are doing is that they are not focused only on stem cells. We are using a combination of things, and to that I say yes, that's true. I'm not trying to say that stem cells alone work. I'm trying to say a combination of things work. So our studies are based on a combination of things, and I'm going to talk to you about what that is. And that's the word we've coined. We call it neuro-regenerative rehabilitation therapy. It's called NRRT. The word neuro refers to neuroprotective therapies. Regenerative is the use of stem cells. And all of us in this field realize that without rehabilitation, we'd get nowhere. So it's this combination of using neuroprotective therapies, cellular therapies, and rehabilitation that we're going to finally be able to make a difference to the quality of lives of people who suffer from damage or disease of the nervous system. When we started this work, our choice was which type of stem cell to use, how should we transplant it, when to treat, and which conditions to treat. And honestly, although I'm going to show you what we do, to be honest, we did what we did because it was easy, it was available. Where I come from, resources aren't easy to come by. We work in public health. There's a tremendous pressure of clinical work. So resources for research are little. And so we opted for something that was easy, that was available, that was simple. There's a scientific basis to it, but the real answer is we did it because it was simple and it was easily available. Our fundamental principle, like friend Yor just said, is primum non nocere in Latin, which means first do no harm. It's a basic neurosurgical principle. So whenever we are thinking of therapies, which approach, this was first on our mind, first do no harm. The other thing was what Dr. Lars Leksell, I trained in Stockholm, and this was one of his famous quotes. He said, keep it simple. If you keep it simple, it will always be safe and it will be beautiful. These two things, simplicity and safety, is something which is always in our mind whenever we are designing a project, a trial, or anything else. So why we chose to work with adult stem cells in the clinical setting was, first, it was safe, there were no side effects, we all know there are no rejection, no ethical problems, but most important, it comes in the permissive category of the Indian Council of Medical Research. Now, why did we choose the intrathecal? I'm giving the explanation of what we are doing before I get there. We chose to do this intrathecally, and there was a lot of criticism about, criticism means when in our discussions with my colleagues as to what is this intrathecal business? Because why don't you put it directly into the cord? So here's the explanation. Firstly, of course, the intrathecal route is minimally invasive. It reduces the risk of the procedure. So when you're trying something new, you don't want to cause any harm. The patients accept it more easily. There was published literature which showed the effectiveness of injecting this into CSF, and there were clinical studies. So there are these various studies that actually showed that bone marrow MNCs could convert into neurons. There were a whole lot of other studies which, I won't go into the details of these studies. And then there were these studies of injection into CSF, but the one that got our attention was this one from stem cell development by Calera in Brazil. Here 16 patients with chronic SCI were divided into two groups. Group 1 received their own CD34 counts labeled with nanoparticles via lumbar puncture, and group 2 just received magnetic beads without stem cells. Now MRI done 20 and 35 days later showed that in 5 out of the 10 patients the CD34 counts, the CD34 cells had actually over the site of the lesion. So this was the first time that I saw that if you injected it through a lumbar puncture, there was MRI documentation that these CD34 counts, cells were honed into the lesion. Now it happened in only half the patients, 5 out of 10. But this was evident. This was the evidence that we actually needed. That this was something doable. And this was the other paper that on which we primarily based our trial, the one which came from Korea, published in Tissue Engineering. This again got our attention because out of the 7 patients, 6 patients showed an improvement in ASIA scale. Here again, so our protocols were sort of basically based around this publication. Now I just want to run through basically what are the ethics and regulations in our country. There are 3 parts to it. There is legal, there is legal regulatory, and there is ethical. Now legally there is no law in India, which means in India one could actually do anything. So we have people in Delhi, we have gynecologists who, they're doing all kinds of things with embryonic stem cells. So there's a whole lot of things going on because there's no law that says you can't do it or you can do something. But there are regulatory medical guidelines, and these come under what is called the Indian Council of Medical Research. They have laid down a very sort of clear-cut guideline. This is published, it's a sort of guideline published by the Indian Council of Medical Research. It's called the National Guidelines, and it's very comprehensive, it's very simple, and it's very forward-thinking. They've divided things into 3 categories: prohibitive, restrictive, and permissive. Cloning, for example, is prohibitive, embryonic stem cell work is restrictive, but umbilical cord and adult stem cell work is permissive. Basically what they say is if you're doing adult stem cell work, you have to set out what is called an ICSCRT, that is Institutional Committee for Stem Cell Research and Therapy. Now this is like an institutional ethics committee which only looks into stem cell projects. So what ICMR says is your institute may be having an institutional ethics committee, but it needs to have another committee which only looks at stem cell projects. So according to ICMR, if you're working with adult stem cells, that's all you need. Basically, that means you need your institutional clearance. If you're working with umbilical cord stem cells, you also need the approval of a Director General that looks into these issues, because if you're using a marketable product, if you're using a product that's outside, you need a second clearance. But if you're working with embryonic stem cells, you need clearance from the Indian Council of Medical Research also. It recommends that we form a committee, and that committee should be registered with the government. The lab should meet GMP standards, and you need your own institutional ethics committee and ICSRT clearance, and you should take special informed consent. Now, it actually defines what the institutional committee for stem cells should be like. It should have 9 members, and it must include a public representative, a legal person, a gynecologist involved in IF, a development biologist, a clinician. So it actually lists down what this committee should consist of. Now, informed consent has been clearly laid down. There's a law for informed consent. It says that, amongst other things, informed consent must include the diagnosis. In detail, patient must know what they are suffering from, the nature of the treatment, the risk involved, the prospects of success, you have to explain to the patient prognosis if this treatment is not given, and all possible alternative treatments must be explained. Now if this is not there, the consent is not called informed consent. So there's a very clear law which the Supreme Court lays down on what is informed consent. Then there is the ethical aspect, and the ethical aspect actually, each institute asks us, so when we are doing, our institute asks us what is our ethical criteria, and is the Helsinki Declaration, which it's interesting. What it says is that in the treatment of a patient where proven prophylactic diagnostic therapeutic methods do not exist or have been ineffective, the physician with informed consent from the patient must be free to use unproven or new measures if in the physician's judgment it offers hope of saving life, re-establishing health or alleviating suffering. So in our project actually we've included this. Now what this means, for example, is that we can only include in our trial people for whom all other treatment options have been exhausted. Now in practical terms it means I can't treat Parkinson's patients, because we've clearly been told that for Parkinson's patients there are other therapies. So whenever there's another drug therapy or there is deep brain stimulation, we cannot use cellular therapies for those patients. We can use it for spinal cord injury, paraplegia, quadriplegia, because nothing else to give them. We can use it for other diseases like motor neuron disease, muscular dystrophies, where there's no other treatment option. But for Parkinson's, epilepsy, things like that we can't use. So this is the ethical guideline on which our work is based. Roughly to run to the materials and methods. Like I said, we are doing two simultaneous studies. I'm going to present both of them together. One is, now you notice we call it NRRT, Neuro Regenerative Rehabilitation Therapy. And one is in chronic spinal cord injury and one is in incurable neurological conditions. Roughly I'll explain to you, this includes the patient gets granulocyte colony stimulating factor before, a bone marrow aspiration is done, then a separation of MNCs is done by the density gradient method, intrathecally these cells are injected. At that time of injection, methylprednisolone is given in the spinal cord dose, lithium is given for 6 weeks, and there's a vigorous rehab program for 6 months. Now you can understand why we are criticized, because this includes everything. And what the criticism is using a cocktail. And I say yes, I like cocktails, and I believe that this cocktail works. And yes, of course, from a scientific point of view, one needs to break down. We don't know what is, it could just be the lithium, because each of these things has a beneficial effect. Just giving granulocyte colony stimulating factor is known to have an effect. Lithium itself has an effect. Methylprednisolone has an effect, and a rehabilitation program. But what we want to show is that all of this together works. And so this is what we do. This is a standard procedure. We give the factor, then we aspirate the bone marrow from the hip bone. This is a standard procedure. We take 120 ml, we dilute in 1:1 PBS, and then there's a standard density gradient method of separation. A viability count is done. The total count of MNCs is calculated. The CD34 count is obtained. What is recommended in literature is the weight of the patient multiplied by 10⁶ cells have to be injected. But we roughly inject about, in the range of 50 to 10⁶. And now this is a very simple procedure. All it requires is a simple lab, a biosafety cabinet, a centrifuge, a microscope, few simple things. This takes about, little more than 2 to 3 hours to do, and the same day you can inject these back. So it's the simplicity of the procedure. So that's the stem cell separation in our laboratory, and like I said, they are separated by the density gradient method. It's a very simple, it's a well described technique, and that's the method. And then you get the buffy coat, and the buffy coat is, and then you inject it sort of intrathecally. You put in a lumbar needle, and then it's actually injected. And now here the quantity doesn't matter because you're putting it into the CSF. The mechanisms, you discussed this enough, I'm not going to talk about this, we've had enough discussion on this. We incidentally, some of the bone marrow things, we actually cultured them outside the lab and grew, and it's interesting, this is what we saw. The MNC started converting into cells that sort of resemble neuron cells, and the most interesting thing about these is the neurites they were forming, and the sort of connections that they are attempting to make with each other. So we found this very, very interesting. So the main part of my talk, what are the clinical results? Our intention is to do 100 spinal cord injury patients and 200 others, but I'm going to present the data of 58 spinal cord injury patients, 142 others, where there's a minimum follow-up of 1 month. These are the other diseases that we have treated. These are the scales that we use, the Asia scale, modified Ashworth's, FIM. These are the scales that we use for evaluation. All the patients also have electrophysiological tests done before and imaging done before. That's the Asia scale, and that's the FIM scale, and that's the expanded disability scale, and that's the Kurtz functional score. These are the standard systems. Now, for sort of trying to figure out what's happening, now this is something we made up. We just made it up. We divided the improvement into 4 categories. Patients who deteriorated, where there was no improvement, mild, moderate, and significant improvement. Now, deterioration is deterioration, we all know what is. No improvement is no improvement. Mild improvement is when the patient reported subjective changes. The patient said, I can feel better, I can sit better, the patient said they could do things better. Or most often, the caregiver said that it was much easier to handle the patient. So, actually the patient and the caregiver said they felt better, but we did not find any neurological deficit. We found no change in the patient. Moderate improvement was when there was a definite improvement in the FIM score. And significant improvement was when there was actually a shift in Asia and other scales and a demonstrable neurological improvement, like an improvement in power, shift in sensory levels. So we have 4 now. According to me as a neurosurgeon, this is the real improvement. So when you see this is the real improvement. This is something which is objective, which can be evaluated by anyone. These could be partly because of the other things that are happening. So this is just to let you know, because we are going to see a whole lot of charts which will have all these 4. So this is to explain to you. In our mind, we treat this group as no improvement. So deterioration, no improvement, and mild, we consider this as no improvement, and we consider this as improvement. So the limitation of this data is that we are in the middle of the study, so we don't have a uniform follow-up. That means there are patients. The findings that you see will be from the last follow-up. So there are some patients whose last follow-up is 1 year, and there are some patients whose last follow-up is 1 month only. That's because this data has been analyzed in the middle of the study, so that's a limitation. It's just to let you know. Now this is just the overall data of 200 patients. You can see 4% of the patients deteriorated. So we had some mortality, that there were deaths unrelated to the procedure. So, but I'll explain those data. 27% of the patients had no improvement. 28% had a mild improvement. But we consider this to be no improvement. That means almost 60% of the patients overall have not improved. But 40% of the patients have, of which 24 have had a moderate improvement and 17% have had a significant improvement. This again is what we consider real improvement. This group of patients is happy because there is a change in their life. This group of patients is not so happy. So this is our overall data, but as you will see, this varies grossly from disease to disease. So this is just a rough 40-60 sort of 60% of the patients showing no response and 40% showing a response. So let's look at our spinal cord injury data. There was more males than there were females, 69% males, and there were 20 paraplegics and remaining were tetraplegics. We had 42 complete injuries and 16 incomplete. The majority of the patients, 90%, were road traffic accidents. We had some other electric shocks, fall, gunshot injuries. And these are the symptoms of the patients. Obviously, all of them had weakness. They were paraplegic or quadriplegic. All of them had sensory loss, 100%. 57% of the patients had spasticity. Incontinence was there in 91% of the patients. 13% had bed sores, and 5% had postural hypertension. So this is what the clinical presentation was, and this is the overall results of spinal cord injury. What I showed you last time was of the entire group of 200. As you can see, 3 patients have deteriorated, of which 1 was a death, but it was because of some other medical problem. 2 have deteriorated, and we look into that. It's very interesting that some of the patients improved in spasticity, but sometimes the spasticity is good to have. And when the spasticity reduces, these people actually feel weaker. 12% had no improvement, 28% had mild improvement, and so about 55% of the people actually improved, of which this was the good group, because here we had people actually improving in Asia scale by 1 or 2, and this is where there is an improvement in FIM. So the results of spinal cord injury are better than the overall results, so 55% improved and 45% did not. So this is our spinal cord injury data. And like I said, out of the 58 patients, 1 patient shifted by 2 grade in Asia, but 11 patients shifted by 1 grade on Asia, which is good. And if you see the FIM scores, 38 patients shifted on the FIM score. These are the different levels of shifting. Some patients shifted up to 45, some up to 5. So, but 38 out of the 58 patients shifted on the functional scores. This was something interesting. We were looking at the difference between males and females. We were just analyzing on basis of gender, and we found that females tended to do better. I mean, if you look at this red, this is the significant improvement group. So you will notice that 43% of the women showed a significant improvement as compared to 11% males. Also, if you notice the no improvement, it is less in women as compared to the men. And this is something which Weiss has been talking about for some time, about the role of progesterone as a neuroprotective agent in spinal cord injury. And so our results are showing that females have tended to do better than males. The other thing we found was a direct correlation between CD34 counts and improvement. Now this is what we did is we divided this into no improvement, mild, moderate improvement group, and then there were the counts. So this is 0 to 0.5, 0.5 to 1, 1 to 1.5, 1.5 to 2. So if you notice in the 1 to 1.5 and 1.5 to 2, there is no improvement. In other words, if the CD34 count was more than 1, there was no patient who did not have an improvement. Now, of course, the overall number was small, but in this group there is no green, there is no improvement. So it's interesting. We have to analyze this in greater detail. We have to do a full-fledged statistical evaluation, but the improvement seems to be connected to CD34 counts, and we found this again interesting. This is the total number of cells. Our mean was 46.7, 10 raised plus. And this is again the same. This is more detailed analysis of on the gender basis. So that's 43, 11, and you can see in the no improvement, only 14% of the women had no improvement, but 21% of the males had no improvement. Again, this is to show that females did better than males. We tried to correlate age and improvement, but we could not come up with anything. So we were expecting to see younger people do better, but that didn't show out. So we are not unable to get a correlation with age. We tried to correlate between duration since injury and improvement, but again we couldn't come out with any pattern. It was all random. There was nothing of statistical significance. This is just to show you the kind of improvement. D8 paraplegia, 20-year-old male, paraplegic since a year, and that's the fine. And just to show an example that after the treatment he can stand and walk with the help of calipers. He could not do sitting, and static and dynamic balance is improved. He's become independent in his dressing and ADLs. He transfers independently. And from somebody who for an entire year did not get out of bed, he's today back to work and he's earning a living. That's before and after the therapy. So that was spinal. Now we look at each of the disease groups. Let's look at multiple sclerosis. Here again, that's the male-female distinction. The presenting symptoms, as you can see, incoordination, urine control, speech, vision, spasticity. This is what the patients present with. We've treated 20 such patients, and these are the improvements symptom-wise. So the coordination, 8 out of 14, that is 57% improved in their coordination. 71% got back urine control, and this was a finding we didn't expect, and the patients are very happy with that. A lot of patients improved in their speech. 25% had vision improvement. But again, this was the surprise finding both in spinal cord injury and here, is that spasticity improves a lot. In all the things we are finding that, and this was not something we expected. We were looking for improvement in power, but we are actually finding that spasticity is improving. And in the multiple sclerosis, so this is the number of patients who had, the number of patients is 20, but 14 people had coordination problems. So 8 out of 14 improved in that. 12 had vision problems. 3 out of those 12, 25% improved in that. So there are different symptoms, and But there's a little limitation here. You have to understand that multiple sclerosis is a disease which has a sort of remitting, relapsing phase. So it's unlike spinal cord injury where once you have a neurological damage that persists, here there is a waxing and waning. So although you have all these improvements, it's difficult to completely pinpoint it to the therapy that we are giving. But if you break it up again, it's 50-50. So 50% of the patients did not improve and 50% of the patients improved. So this is the overall result in multiple sclerosis. And if you see the FIM scores, then 11 out of 20 patients shifted on the FIM score, some as much as 25 to 30, others smaller. And the other scale that we use is EDSS, and again 11 patients shifted on that, which is quite substantial. And if you see the Kurtz scale, again 14 out of 20 patients showed a significant change on this scale. Just to give you an example, of multiple sclerosis, a 40-year-old woman, MS, known since 7 years. These are the symptoms she had: incoordination, intention tremors, slurred speech. She was totally independent. MRI showed the classic multiple demyelinating plaques, and these are the improvements she had. There was improvement in her static and dynamic balance. Her incoordination decreased. She could do SLR without much shaking. Nystagmus is resolved. Squint is reduced. This was something which she was really very happy about. She was able to pick up different objects, hand movements, urine control was better, speech improved. This is something we find a lot of the patients of MS, their speech improves. The relatives from far away can tell the difference in voice, and a lot of ADL improves. So these are the improvements that, the kind of improvements one can expect in multiple sclerosis. So this is before and after the stem cell therapy. Then the next disease is muscular dystrophy. Now here there's a bit of a this thing, because the other diseases all have their origin in the nervous system. In muscular dystrophy, the problem is not in the central nervous system, it's in the muscles. So there was this thing about whether we should treat them as stem cells or not. So with a little modified approach, we decided to treat them. Here again, as we are well aware, muscular dystrophy is much more common in males. So we had more males than females. There's a different breakup. The most common is something called Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, but you have others also, like facioscapulohumeral limb girdle. And this is their presentation of abdominal gait, scoliosis. This is what they present with. And these are the improvements that we saw after treatment. The trunk strength, half the patients improved in the trunk strength. But we noticed that the majority of people improved the lower limb strength, not many improved in their upper limb strength. But the gait improved in all. So now these people, this is again a disease that's progressive. So these improvements make a big difference to the patients. So here if you see the results, we have 52% of the patients in the no improvement group, 48% of the patients in the moderate to significant group. Now in addition, because the problem in muscular dystrophy is not in the central nervous system, in addition, only in muscular dystrophy, in addition to intrathecal injection, we also inject into the muscles. Now this was something which was suggested to us by our rehabilitation therapists. They pulled out some literature and showed us where it is done. And what they do is, our therapists do a manual evaluation. They identify which muscles need strengthening. And then they identify what are called motor points. Now, a motor point is the point where the main nerve enters the muscle, and what they do is they electronically sort of determine it, and then we inject into those muscles. So these are the kind of muscles that we commonly in the lower limbs inject into, the anti-gravity muscles. And this is the way there's an electric stimulator. They identify the motor point, they mark it, and then in addition to intrathecal, we also inject stem cells into the motor point of the muscles. These are the muscles of the upper limb. But this is done only for muscular dystrophy. We don't do this for others. And this is to show the upper limb injections. Now let's take one case of Duchenne muscular dystrophy, a 14-year-old boy, DMD since 8 years, totally wheelchair bound, grade 0 power, proximal muscle weakness was more than distal. And after, his action of peroneal longus and brevis is improved from grade 0 to 1. He can now invert the foot, his trunk control is better, sitting balance is better, he's able to sit without support, neck holding is better, he can stand almost alone without support, he balances with good trunk control. So, for somebody who had never seen any of this, the improvement is quite dramatic. These may not appear big to us, but for a patient who is suffering, a patient who is dependent, all these things can mean a lot. That's before and after the therapy. Now the disease where we've had our worst results, motor neuron disease. Now there are a very large number of patients. We treat almost 40 patients here. And these are the symptoms they come with. They normally have speech, swallowing, neck holding problems, muscle weakness, fasciculations, respiratory complications. So these are the symptoms that they come to us with. But here the results weren't very good. In fact, this is the only group where we've had negative FIM, where we had patients actually go down, because this is a disease that's very rapidly progressive, and if you see, the results are extremely poor. In fact, our safety and adverse events committee has actually asked us to discontinue doing this after we've done the interim data. So we're going to stop doing motor neuron disease, because 92% of the patients don't respond. And in fact, this is going to be our first publication actually out of this is going to be on this, because we're going to publish this, because there are people all over the place who are treating patients with this, and we're going to actually publish this data and show that the results of this are very poor. There's a high mortality. We've had 3 of our patients have died, not because of treatment, they died several months later. Many more. So our results with motor neuron disease are extremely poor. Like I said, 20% patients deteriorate, 60% no improvement, 92% overall no improvement, 8%. And then we identified this, and what we found is that those patients who are less than 40 and who do not have bulbar symptoms are symptoms when the brainstem is involved, so where they don't have swallowing, breathing difficulty, they tend to do better. The moment they have developed bulbar symptoms, and those patients who are beyond 40, they come in this group. So it's very important that when we have negative data, this is also published and put across, so that people don't continue doing this work. So this is a motor neuron disease. But here, just to show you one of the patients who did improve, although she was 52, she improved. The doctor's mother actually, she had drooling of saliva, visible fasciculations, as you can see, thickening, very classic MND. And after treatment, the fasciculations and cramps reduced, speech improved dramatically, almost 80% normal, salivation and drooling reduced, fine movements of the hand improved, grip strength and pinch improved, and a thenar eminence, which was completely wasted, started filling up with recovery of muscles. So that's the improvement before and after therapy. Then the next group is stroke. We have a very small study. We've just done 7 patients, of which 3 were hemorrhagic, 4 were ischemic. That's the distribution: MCA, PC, infarct, basal ganglia. The symptoms that they come with: speech, cognition, spasticity, hand, gait. And these are the improvements after NRRT. The speech improved in all the patients. 4 of these patients had a speech problem. All 4 improved in their speech. Cognition improved in 2 out of 3. Again, spasticity. Spasticity improves in all the patients. Spinal cord injury, muscular dystrophy, stroke. So that's been the interesting part. That's been the fun part here, to discover something that you weren't expecting. Gait improved in some, and hand function improved. So these are the improvements, but this is very small, just 7 patients, not enough to be significant, but yeah, they do show improvement. So if you see as a percentage wise, 72% improved and 28 didn't, but like I said, this number is very small. This is like one of the patients, 16-year-old female, hemorrhagic infarct, there was thalamic bleed, speech, cognitive effects, there was unilateral neglect. That's the MRI scan. And after the treatment, her right side of the awareness body, earlier she was not aware that she had a right side. The first thing we see is the spasticity, clawing of the hand, it opens up completely. Right hand opening was possible, and she started using it functionally, and cognitively, emotionally, she can now see the clock, participate in family discussions. That's before and after the therapy. We tried to compare, of course, a very small thing, but because we found that if it's less than 5 years, then those patients, of course, tend to do better. We tried to compare it in time sequence. Then cerebral palsy. Again, we had, there was a big male predominance, 11 males versus 1 female. And these are the symptoms that they come with: muscle tone, seizure frequency. Now here, the interesting finding was this one, that in 58%, the seizure frequency reduced. In fact, in some it disappeared. I mean, this is completely not expecting this. In fact, one of our exclusion criteria was people with uncontrolled epilepsy, not to take them in for this. And we found that those who had this epilepsy were included, it actually came down. So there was improvement in the muscle tone, there was improvement in the cognition, in their swallowing, in the speech, neck holding. This is 9 out of 12 improved in sitting balance, 6 out of 12 had leg and hand movements. But this, as a neurosurgeon and neurologist, I found this very, very interesting. And this, I have no explanation. If you ask me why, I don't know. I have no clue why. In fact, we were worried it might actually increase. Incidence of epilepsy might increase. But to see that it actually dropped and in some it completely disappeared, but I don't know why. But it was an interesting finding. So in CP, where we actually were expecting the worst response, we actually got the best. So 76% of the, because here this is hypoxic brain injury, brain is damaged at birth. We thought they're not going to improve. And there they were, showing dramatic improvements. So much better than the other average. Here's a cerebral palsy child, 3 months spastic, poor neck holding, eye contact delayed, truncal hypertonia. The MRI showed the classic hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. Here again, the speech improved. She started attempting to babble, neck holding improved, eye contact localization was better, hand functions came back. This is something which happens in all patients, and this is a dramatic improvement because the caretakers, the mothers, find it very, very useful. Their adductor spasticity, that scissoring of the leg which they have, for some reason, again, it's got to do with the spasticity. It's the reduction, because when this reduces, suddenly it's much easier to take care of them. The same child who was so difficult to move, now you can take care of much better. So that's before and after the therapy. And apart from that, we treated some miscellaneous conditions. Now there are a whole lot of miscellaneous, these are just one, different kinds of conditions that we treated. And here, of course, the miscellaneous group, we didn't get good results. Only an 18% improvement, 82% no improvement. This is just one patient who had a post-viral demyelination. She was in a terrible position, very odd posturing, unable to sit, stand because of severe arthroid movements, hypertonia, bilateral foot talipes equinovirus. Both the hands were fisted, and post-stem cell therapy, the fisting reduced with voluntary control. The palms opened up, sitting balance improved. She could stand with the help of a push knee. She did this after 10 years or so, and trunk control improved. So all these improvements happened following the treatment. Our complications. 50 of the patients had very severe excruciating. When I say severe, this is really bad. It's a terrible headache, which is associated with vomiting and neck pain. It becomes worse on sitting. It lasts 3 to 4 days. It does not respond to analgesics. Those who have this headache, they make life very miserable for us and for everyone, because I think this is kind of chemical meningitis, because it looks like that. There is neck stiffness, vomiting and headache, and I can only think of the intrathecal injection is irritating the meninges. So it's like a chemical meningitis, but this is a very severe headache. About 37 patients had a milder version of this, which lasted for lesser time. So actually, if you see, almost 1/4 of the patients developed this headache, vomiting symptom. 2 patients had lithium-induced tremors because their levels shot up beyond 1. Now, about neuropathic pain, the thing is, this is something we are looking for, okay? But there's not a single patient who actually complained of it, who required therapy. They do report increase in tingling, numbness, sensations, dysarthric pain. They report changes, but it's not a problem with them. In fact, they take it as a good sign. They take it as a sign of sensations returning. We've not had to treat a single patient for pain, so we are looking for it. We ask specific questions, and there are patients who do develop sensory symptoms that resemble neuropathic pain, but for some reason in our population, they don't complain about it and they don't need medication for it. So I mention this because this is reported. Everybody talks of neuropathic pain. They do get these sensations which are odd. They find it difficult to describe them. They call it tingling, numbness. They say warmth increases from inside, all kinds of things. But we ask them whether they need to medication for it, and they all refuse. So we have not treated anybody. Now these are the patients who at last follow-up died. 3 of the motor neuron diseases, they died because of aspiration pneumonia. 1 stroke patient had myocardial infarction, 1 patient had hypertensive brain stroke, 1 other patient had a hip surgery for some other reason, he died post-surgery. Now none of these were directly related to the stem cells, but actually this is the one that's bothering us. This is only 3 of the beginning patients, and I sense that out of the 40 patients we have treated, many more are going to be in this group. And so this is the dangerous group. Now this is the mortality at last follow-up. So these are patients who we have treated who are now dead. But none of this is directly attributable to the stem cell therapy. It happened. So The summary of our results: most patients improved in truncal balance, ability to sit without support. Virtually all patients have this. There's an improvement in perception of sensations, even if on a sensory examination we don't see a difference. There's better appreciation of bladder filling, there's reduction in spasticity, motor power improvement up to 1 to 2, improvements in speech, and overall. This is like a general sort of picture that we have seen. All this needs teamwork, like they say in Latin, nobody knows enough alone. And a very important role in this is of the physiotherapist and the entire team. And what's the role? Very often people ask me, what's my role? I mean, I'm a neurosurgeon. I love operating. I love operating on the spine. I love fixing it with plates and screws. I love doing brain tumors. So what am I doing with sticking needles into people's backs and injecting stem cells? And I think our role is something like this, like, an orchestra. I've got to coordinate this whole thing as a neurosurgeon, because patients come to us. They come to us in trust. They come to us in faith. They believe in us. And it's our job to see that, everybody, the violin player, the piano player, everybody is doing their thing right, because eventually it's going to be a teamwork. We all got to put it all together. And so our role is really to see that the lab people, the clinical people, the rehabilitation people all do everything in sync. So in conclusion, adult stem cells are easily and safely harvested. They're easily injected. When you give it in the form of this, 30 to 50% of the patients show an improvement. Results in motor neuron disease are very poor, so it should not be done. The improvement is not dramatic. It's not as much as the patients expect. We are not sure of the exact indications, prognostic factors. It's a safe therapy with no serious immediate adverse effects, but we don't know the long-term effects as yet. There's definite hope, but also a lot of hype, so one has to be cautious. And what one needs is more multicentric trials where we work together. Gratefully acknowledge all members of my team, without whom none of this would have been possible. And I normally like to end with this picture of, this is an Indian god, Lord Ganesh. He's got an elephant head on a human body. And in India, for all of us who work in this field, we talk of Ganesh as being the first person to have received stem cell therapy, because we say there was no way. The story goes that his father chopped off his head by mistake in a fit of anger. And then he had to put it back, and then he couldn't find his head, so he put an elephant head. So what we say is that for him to put an elephant head on a human body, he must have known something about stem cells, because there's no way without stem cells he would have put this elephant head here. So thank you for your attention.